Hey everybody, it's Rabbit, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the best Chinese tank in the game of War Thunder. And as a quick reminder for the rules for this series, we are not going to be looking at any anti-aircraft units, we are only going to be looking at vehicles available in the mainline tech tree, and we are going to be looking at a combination of both the win rate and the kills per death. And with no further ado, the highest win rates for any ground vehicle in the Chinese tech tree are the MBT-2000 at number 1, the ZTZ88A at number 2, the ZTZ99 Block 3 at number 3, the ZLT11 at number 4, and the ZTZ99A at number 5. For the highest kills per death in the Chinese tech tree, we have at number 1 the ZTZ88A, at number 2 the PTZ89, at number 3 the AFT09, at number 4 the MBT-2000, and at number 5 we have the ZTZ96. And the winner here is pretty easy to determine. It is the ZTZ88A with a total of only 3 points at the second in win rate and the first in kills per death. The MBT-2000 did put up a pretty good fight though. It is number 1 in win rate and number 4 in kills per death, giving it a score of only 5. So these two are pretty neck and neck with each other. The MBT-2000 and the ZTZ88A, however, are at basically completely different battle ratings. The MBT-2000 is all the way up at 11.0, and the ZTZ88A is all the way down at 9.0. With that being said, however, it is actually pretty interesting to note that there is only one vehicle that is above 11.0 on this list, and there are no vehicles below 9.0 on this list. So the Chinese tech tree does appear to be pretty top heavy between 9.0 and 11.0 with pretty quality vehicles. And of course, in the ZTZ88A's lineup at 9.0, we also see two sister vehicles, the PTZ89 and the AFT09, so it does look like this is a pretty strong battle rating for China in particular. That being said, there is another tank, the ZTZ88B, that is at the exact same battle rating, and the A is actually folded with the B, but the B isn't on this list at all. We only see the A, which is kind of interesting. Now, looking at the ZTZ88A, you could be forgiven for believing that it is just a T-54. It actually does have an expanded and elongated hull with a more powerful engine and also some additional composites on it. It's actually closer in practice to something like the T-55AM or AMD-1. The ZTZ88A has an engine with 730 horsepower at 38.5 tons, so a total of 19 horsepower per ton. Honestly, for this battle rating, that's some pretty decent mobility. It's not exceptional, but it's not bad by any means. The forward gear capping out at 57 kph is also perfectly fine. It's actually pretty standard for this battle rating. The backwards gear of 9 kilometers an hour can be pretty painful, but honestly, yet again, most of the vehicles around 9.0 don't get dramatically better than this anyway. You're really looking at things like the MPT or KPZ70 around this battle rating that might outclass it. I will say subjectively that taking this vehicle out and then taking out some of the T55 series tanks later, I did notice that the ZTZ88A feels noticeably snappier and more responsive, and also just generally has some pretty good acceleration, at least in the forward aspects. Obviously the 9 kph reverse gear can get you in some trouble at times, but it's not really that much worse than most of the other tanks of this battle rating. It's not like the M48 and M60 series, which are other vehicles you're going to be fighting, are dramatically better. So on the whole, I would say the mobility for its BR is pretty decent. It borders on the good but doesn't quite get there. The armor is where the ZTZ88A starts to get kind of interesting. While the turret looks like it's a T55, in practice it actually does have some slight reinforcements around the frontal aspect, so it is a little bouncier than a T55, but honestly I wouldn't be baiting shots with this anytime soon. The upper hull is really where I think you experience the most difference in terms of performance, because the upper hull can get upwards of 300 millimeters in terms of protection depending on angle, distance, etc, etc. And this is actually enough to eat some of the tougher enemy shells. On top of that, the vehicle does look a lot like a T-55, which might not sound like much, but if people are used to aiming center mass when they see a T-55 silhouette and they aim center mass on the ZTZ88A, they might experience that their shells that would pen a T-55 are now not penning the ZTZ88A. So in a lot of respects, I do feel like the vehicle's visual similarities to a more standard tank that has weaker armor actually does benefit a lot. Much like like how in the Russian tree you have the Su-85 and then you have the Su-85M that look very similar unless you're used to picking out the differences, but the 85M actually has noticeably better armor across the frontal aspect. With all that being said, however, I wouldn't say the armor of the ZTZ88A is particularly reliable. Obviously, most enemies can pin you and most enemies can kill you, and especially if they just go straight for the turret, the left or right of the turret face, they're probably gonna pin more often than they don't, although occasionally they do bounce, but it is pretty uncommon. So it is one of those vehicles that, while the armor is workable, I wouldn't regard the armor as so good that you can be super aggressive with it, or at least more aggressive than you can be with a more typical tank of its BR. You always have to behave as though the enemy can pin you and can kill you, because while the armor reinforcing is good, it's not good enough to really defeat an opponent who is taking careful aim. With that being said, the vehicle also has a 4-man crew, and the ammo storage isn't the worst in my experience, so generally speaking, I will say the vehicle does survive penetrating hits quite frequently, even if it doesn't always survive penetrating hits in a condition to return fire. This does sometimes give you an extra life, especially if you have other teammates nearby that can assist you or get the enemy that just shot at you, but again, it's not terrifically reliable. So ultimately, I would characterize the armor as the ZTZ88A as very usable but not consistent enough to be a regular advantage that you can really push. Moving on to the firepower, and you do have a nice roof-mounted machine gun on the ZTZ88A, which is pretty useful because you're still in the battle rating of AH-1G early rushes, so you will see some helicopters from time to time in a position to shoot them down. On top of that, it's not like every plane at this battle rating has guided ordnance, so some of them will have to get uncomfortably close to shoot at you. So in that respect, I think the roof-mounted machine gun does offer some value, and there are also quite a few light and annoying vehicles like the XM800T, the Fox, etc. around this battle rating that an HMG is certainly pretty useful to handle. The gun is where we start to see some pretty significant departures in terms of looking like and feeling like a T-55 series tank, because the gun on this is essentially just the British L7-105 in Chinese use. You can get the reload all the way down to 7.5 seconds on an Ace crew, which is actually pretty standard for this battle rating. Pretty much all of the L7-105s actually get down to that same reload, so nothing bad there. The bigger issue you're going to run into in overall gun handling is the horizontal and vertical. The traverse rates are fairly poor. The maximum horizontal traverse is only 20 degrees per second on an Ace crew, and the vertical is not significantly better, so you do to an extent have to use a lot of the tactics that you will learn using the T-55 family of trying to swing your hull around to get that extra bit of gun traverse to get your gun on target. Additionally, the vertical guidance, much like with the T-55 family, is still pretty poor at only -4 degrees, so you do have to be aware of that. However, the 88A does feature a 2-plane stabilizer, which is part of the reason why it's at 9.0. On top of that, another reason why it's at 9.0 is because it does have a laser rangefinder, so very easy to land pretty accurate shots, although it doesn't have anything so harrowing as thermal imaging to easily pick out targets, but if you can see it, you can generally hit it, especially because the vehicle does have some pretty high velocity rounds. Now, your starter round, both for the ZTZ88A and the ZTZ88B, is the Type 83 Heat FS round. This is a fairly standard L7-105 heat round that pins about 400 millimeters. It also has an overpressure effect, etc, etc, you get the drill. At 9.0, heat rounds haven't completely fallen off in terms of their ability to take out targets. While you do see some heavier Russian tanks with a lot of ERA on them that can be annoying to deal with, on average most opponents aren't that difficult to dispatch with this shell. That being said, you still want to upgrade into the APFSDS rounds as soon as you get the opportunity. Speaking of, the APDS round on this tank actually has a maximum penetration of 352 millimeters with a pretty good muzzle velocity to boot. I would honestly say this is one of the more effective 105 darts you're actually going to get around this battle rating. There are definitely some that are better, but usually they're on chassis that have much more significant issues in terms of mobility. So the ZTZ88A does have a pretty punchy gun that you can rely on against most targets, especially after you've researched the dart. Both the ZTZ88A and the ZTZ88B have an unlockable HESH round. It's a fairly standard 105 HESH round, nothing really exceptional, mostly useful for incredibly light or open top targets and little else. With that being said, there are two shells that are only available on the ZTZ88A and are not available on the ZTZ88B. The first one is a VT or variable time fuse shell. This can be used to shoot down planes or helicopters, and honestly with the laser rangefinder, especially if you're in a down tier fighting some of the earlier helicopters, things like an Alouette or UH-1B, this is actually a pretty decent shell for taking them out. You can laze them, they don't have laser warning receivers at this battle rating, and then you fire the shell, and as long as they don't move too much, the shell will generally hit near them and take them out. It's a pretty good option to have. Additionally, you also get access to a SAPI round. This is a semi-armor piercing round that can actually pen 97mm before detonating. It's effectively an APHG round that you would find at lower battle ratings, but it's at higher tiers. The 97mm of penetration does give it some pretty good applications against specific targets. However, at this battle rating, I generally found the APFSDS round work perfectly fine against most targets, and 350mm of penetration is a lot better than 97mm of penetration. That being said, I don't think the round is useless. It definitely has some applications. It much more reliably penetrates things like cupolas than, say, your Hesh round. However, much like the Hesh round, it wouldn't be a real priority to research it, as if you're going against open top vehicles, the Heat FS round will generally overpressure them perfectly fine. This is for some pretty niche shots where the enemy has enough armor that your explosive rounds don't overpressure, but not so much armor that you can't simply pen them with 90mm of an APHE round. It's a pretty good round, and once you research it, it isn't a bad idea to take a few of them out. So at this point, the real mystery is why the ZTZ88 specifically. The ZTZ88A is not exactly a world beater of a tank in any area. The gun is perfectly functional, the mobility is perfectly functional, honestly the armor is perfectly functional as well. It's just a generally decent, well-rounded tank that doesn't have any superlative factors working in its favor, and that's kind of the odd part, because the MBT 2000 I do feel actually has pretty good armor and mobility and also a pretty punchy gun for its battle rating, but the ZTZ88A is actually outperforming it pretty consistently to at least a modest degree. One area where I think the ZTZ88A actually has an advantage over some of the other tanks is that it is foldered and it does look very similar to the ZTZ88B, which means that a lot of players, especially ones that aren't particularly skilled, are probably just going to skip straight over it and go to the higher echelons. And that's probably why the ZTZ88B isn't even on the list, whereas the 88A is one of the best performing ones. At least that's my hunch. It's just a much less played tank than the 88B, and if you look at the recent stats on StatShark, this does support it, as the 88A does have noticeably less games over the last few months. Now this is interesting because the 88A actually dropped into the game earlier, so technically it has a very similar number of games overall because the 88B was dropped later and then the A was folded with it. So while they do have a similar number of games in terms of the overall record, once you look at the last few months, you do see the 88B is significantly more played than the A. Now, funnily enough, I actually did a video about the ZTZ88A when it first dropped. Originally, it was just called the ZTZ88A. They didn't differentiate the A or the B. And honestly, I actually kind of liked the tank. I felt it was pretty well rounded and a pretty decent vehicle. And of course, it also goes really well with the Chinese lineups around this battle rating, as you've also seen. I absolutely love the AFT-109. I love the PTZ-89. There was also some other good vehicles like the 122MC, and the helicopters around this battle rating are pretty decent as well. China just in general has a very good 9.0 lineup. This is really the part of the tech tree where China starts to come into its own and get a lot of these domestically produced vehicles that aren't simply copy pastas of their Soviet counterparts. That being said, this is kind of the first vehicle in the series that doesn't have any one area where it really just is head and shoulders above most of the contemporaries in other tech trees. The T-2065 had exceptional armor and combined it with some pretty solid mobility. The Leopard 2A7V had basically everything going for it, and obviously the T-80 VVM has a lot of strong attributes as well, including very solid armor with some pretty good mobility and firepower. The ZTZ88A, on the other hand, compared to basically all contemporary tanks, even within the Chinese tech tree, just feels like a very middle-of-the-road vehicle. It's a reliable work-a-day vehicle that, while it doesn't excel in a lot of areas, the only real downside to the tank is its poor reverse gear. In every other area, it's at least as good, if not better, than many of its contemporaries. And I personally feel like that, in conjunction with it being foldered, is really what allows the 88A to have such good stats. Not only is it being played by people who generally do take the time to flesh out their tech trees a little bit more, i.e. more experienced players, but also it doesn't have any features that are stopping those experienced players from having good games. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. What do you think about the ZTZ88A? Have you even heard of this tank? It's not very common to see in the matchmaker, so I would love to get anybody's thoughts on it if you have experience playing against it or with it. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about this particular vehicle. If you like the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.